Okay, thank you all again for joining us. Again, my name is Amy Barnes, and I'm a senior advisor with the California China Climate Institute. I'm delighted to be here with all of you today. I know that people are still joining, but we're going to just go ahead and get started and allow folks to come on as they do. Just as we start, I would like to remind everyone that we are providing simultaneous translation for this event. So please go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen and select the language that you would like to hear the remarks in. You can go down and listen in either English or Chinese. If you don't see the interpretation button, you may need to extend the width of your Zoom screen to make sure that it shows up. So please do select the language that you would like to hear to today's presentations in. And if you do not choose a language, you will be in the default off mode. Please do not do that. Please do select one language, even if you are bilingual. So California and China's carbon emissions trading systems are two of the world's largest. China's national market started in mid-2021, building on pilot projects in 5 cities and 2 provinces. California's cap and trade program, meanwhile, has been operational since 2013 and is an important part of the state's policies aimed at meeting its 2045 carbon neutrality goal. Today, we'll hear from research teams from both California and China who have been analyzing the markets in both jurisdictions, highlighting both strengths and vulnerabilities and opportunities for reform. The studies you will hear about today were conducted as part of joint research between the California China Climate Institute, Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at UCLA Law, Institute of Energy, Environment, and Economy at Tsinghua University, and Wuhan University. We are very thankful for the generous support of the Berggruen Institute, which enabled this work in California, and the China Institute for Innovation and Development Strategy, which provided support on the Chinese side. Again, I will just quickly reiterate a few housekeeping remarks for those who are just joining us. This event is being simultaneously translated into English and Mandarin Chinese. Please do select the language you would like to hear the event in using the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. If you do not see the icon, you may need to widen your Zoom window so that it shows up, and you may select the language in the drop-down menu there. Second, the discussion is being recorded and will later be available on the California China Climate Institute's website and YouTube channels. And finally, throughout our discussion today, if you would like to direct any questions to our speakers, please do use the question and answer or Q&A function on your screen at any time during the webinar, and I will do my best to direct your question to our speakers and make sure that we answer as many of them as we can. And again, if you do not see the Q&A button in your Zoom window, you may have to widen your window or click the More section and select Q&A. So allow me to introduce our speakers who will provide an overview of the studies from California, China, and Hubei province in China, respectively. First, Dr. Alex Wang is professor of law at UCLA School of Law and a leading expert on environmental governance and the law and politics of China. His research focuses on the social effects of law and the interaction of law and institutions in China and the United States. Previously, Dr. Wang was a senior attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, based in Beijing, and the founding director of NRDC's China Environmental Law and Governance Project. Dr. Wang is also a co-chair of the California-China Climate Institute's Academic Advisory Committee. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Wang. Dr. Zhang Zhilang is a professor and director at the Institute of Energy, Environment, and Economy at Tsinghua University. He has served as the lead author of the 4th and 5th Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, Climate Change Assessment Report, as the Secretary General of the New Energy Committee of China Energy Research Society, and as the Vice Chair of the China Renewable Energy Industry Association. Dr. Zhang has been leading a national carbon market research project, which aims at designing the National Development and Reform Commission China's national emission trading scheme. Dr. Zhang will be providing an update on the Chinese national emissions trading system. Dr. Zhang, thank you for being with us today. And Dr. Qi Shouzhou is a professor and director of the Climate Change and Energy Economics Study Center at Wuhan University. His research focuses on the low carbon economy and its policies. He served as chief economist for the project China's Carbon Emissions Trading System under the Low Carbon Economic Transformation, supported by the Education Ministry of China. Alex, will begin with you. Over to you to start us off.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Amy, and thank you to all of you who've joined us this evening. We're pleased to launch 2 reports today. One is a report from Tsinghua and Wuhan universities on China's national greenhouse gas emissions trading system, and that includes a case study on the Hubei provincial carbon trading pilot. We'll hear more about that in a moment. And then we're also launching a report by our team at UCLA Law in collaboration with the California China Climate Institute on key governance issues in California's carbon emissions trading system. And these reports, as Amy mentioned, are part of a broader collaboration between California and China. And the project has also involved a series of private dialogues on various aspects of emissions trading system design, including topics like data quality, compliance, monitoring, reporting, and verification, auctions, allowance allocation approaches, and so on. So why this collaboration? Carbon markets are arguably at a crossroads right now. As of 2021, we have about 30 emissions trading systems around the world covering about 17% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The finalization of the Paris Agreement rulebook for international cooperation on carbon markets has cleared the way for the expansion of emissions trading and carbon pricing worldwide. And this next phase of climate regulation will benefit from the lessons learned from existing carbon markets, such as in California. Policymakers are going to face a range of issues, from nitty-gritty design issues like measuring and reporting mechanisms, but they'll also face bigger picture concerns, such as whether these systems can reduce pollution at the pace needed to meet climate goals. So for the last 2 years, the researchers from our various institutions have worked together to consider the design and implementation of emissions trading systems with a focus on China's national rate-based system, which launched last year and is the world's largest by emissions covered, and California's economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions trading system, which has now been in operation for about a decade. So as an initial matter, we're pleased that we've been able to engage in this sort of initial international collaboration. It's the sort of joint work that seemed at peril as U.S.-China relations, government-to-government relations have worsened. But in fact, I think our teams have worked very well together, and we've learned a great deal from our exchanges. There's, of course, much more to do, but I think we've shown that climate cooperation is still possible and productive. So what have we hoped to achieve with our project here? First of all, from our side in California, we wanted to share information with Chinese researchers as they get their emissions trading system up to speed. And this includes talking frankly about the successes and the challenges of the system as it's developed over the years. Secondly, we hope that the project can help to increase transparency about the emissions trading systems in China and in California. The Chinese system is quite new, as you know, and at least judging from many media reports, it's not all that well understood. And so I think the reports from our Chinese counterparts here are excellent, and they add to the public information about the thinking behind China's national emissions trading system and the features of one of the leading pilot programs in Hubei province. And then finally, we also wanted to use the project as an occasion to think about the appropriate role of carbon pricing and emissions trading within a broader portfolio of climate policies. So I want to say a bit more about these various points. The following comments are in the nature of key takeaways about the appropriate role of emissions trading and general thoughts on improving the effectiveness of carbon markets. If you're interested in the details of program design, you can take a look at our report, which is available online and goes into much greater detail than I'm able to go into today. So just a few high-level takeaways. I think one thing that one of the lessons from the California approach is the importance of a portfolio approach, where cap and trade is one among an array of climate policies, including the renewable portfolio standards, the low carbon fuel standard, energy efficiency policies, advanced clean car and truck programs, and methane control policies, among others. I don't think this is a controversial position, and I think this is the way that China will use emissions trading. However, there are still some who advocate that carbon pricing should be the central regulatory tool, quote unquote, front and center, as an IMF report has put it in the past, with other policies being complementary. But I think we think that current experience with existing emissions trading systems suggests that a portfolio approach with more modest expectations for emissions trading is warranted. And emissions trading can serve to create incremental incentives to reduce emissions. It can raise revenue. It can support the buildup of emissions monitoring and enforcement systems, and it can do a variety of things like that. But the idea that emissions trading can do the heavy lifting for rapid emissions reductions, I think, has not been borne out in practice to date. The second high-level point that we would make is that we should be in an attitude of continual reform to improve the environmental ambition and integrity and political buy-in for emissions trading. Emissions trading systems are often launched with relatively lenient design features. This is typically justified as giving the system a chance to learn by doing and to gain political buy-in for approval of a program. Yet it can be difficult to make emissions trading systems more environmentally ambitious after program launch. And so emissions trading systems, like all environmental policies, need ongoing review and reform to improve environmental ambition and to ensure the integrity of emissions reductions and to take advantage of opportunities to improve the political economy dynamics of climate policy. For example, by distributing revenues in a way that builds political support and shaves off opposition. So a few more points about this issue of continual reform. So obviously with emissions trading, our goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we want to achieve an appropriate level of ambition. The promise of carbon pricing has always been the potential to reduce emissions at lower costs. But issues of allowance surpluses have been cited as the cause of low allowance prices and for dampening the price signal for polluting firms. And this is one of the challenges of emissions trading systems. Prices that are too high can have unwanted economic impacts, particularly on trade-exposed industries, and it'll draw intense lobbying and political blowback. But prices that are too low will simply not drive emissions reductions in the intended way. So the challenge of finding the just right level is an ongoing challenge. On the issue of environmental integrity, environmental emissions trading systems must also guarantee the integrity of emissions reductions and do well the basic work of tracking emissions. This is an area that California has done a very good job at monitoring, reporting, and verification, and establishing a robust system for tracking most greenhouse gas emissions. But there's also evidence that, for example, methane emissions have been undercounted in places. Offsets have been a contentious area in the California the emissions trading system, and they've been challenge as weakening the environmental integrity of the California ETS. The challenges of ensuring that offsets represent real, quantifiable, permanent, additional, verifiable, and enforceable emissions reductions are real. California has perhaps the most comprehensive protocols for offsets anywhere in the world, but this hasn't quieted the debates over offsets. As a compromise, California law has limited offsets to 4% of compliance obligations for the 21 to 25 period, and limited the number of offsets without in-state benefits that can be utilized for compliance. And the third area of expanding political opportunity, we just highlight that emissions trading systems can also improve the political dynamics for climate policy by raising revenue and distributing that revenue in ways that build political support and help to reduce emissions. California's system uses revenues from auctioning allowances to fund the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, GGRF, and to limit cost increases to electricity users. Systems and processes for continual reform and oversight are important for identifying issues and instituting improvements to the environmental performance of emissions trading systems. In California, we have a variety of mechanisms for this. In the scoping plan, California's climate change planning process, there's an opportunity for looking at various regulatory tools. There are also oversight institutions such as the Legislative Analyst's Office in the legislature and the Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee established in 2017, of which our commenter, Dallas Bertrall, is a member. And in addition, continual reform is necessary so that emissions trading systems obviously don't become merely symbolic symbolic regulation, or even worse, create harmful negative consequences for climate policy, for example, by inadvertently subsidizing fossil fuel use or preempting useful complementary regulations. So I'll end my remarks with just some implications of the California experience for China. I think China's ETS, which we'll hear more about in a moment, has started in a classic learning by doing mode. Chinese researchers like Dr. Zhang are well aware of and are looking at a range of reforms to the Chinese emissions trading system already, and are looking at ways to improve the system. We want to offer a few thoughts of our own on this issue. So I want to just enumerate 6 potential areas for focus, which I know the Chinese researchers are well aware of, but from our outsiders' perspective, these are of interest. So first is the issue of moving from a tradable performance standard to a mass-based cap and trade system. It would be interesting to think about moving more aggressively here in the power sector, given the availability of alternative electricity sources like wind and solar. So that's first. Second is the issue of auctioning allowances rather than giving away allowances for free. Tsinghua's own research with the IEA has shown that additional auctioning would accelerate emissions reductions, including through greater fuel switching to non-fossil technologies. Third, with auctioning, using the revenue from those auctions to support climate and other environmental initiatives, to limit economic impacts, to ease job transitions, and to build political support for climate policy. Fourth is developing strong protocols and oversight for the use of offsets, which are sure to grow within China's system as its emissions trading system matures. Fifth is focusing on data accuracy and monitoring, reporting, and verification. This is an area where California has a rather mature system, and it's an excellent opportunity for further collaboration. And then finally, the arrival of the national carbon emissions trading system in China has highlighted the need for reforms in other parts of the Chinese system, like in the electricity grid, for example, rules on dispatch and regional grid integration. These are points that are raised in the Chinese reports. And there's a chance, certainly, that the emissions trading system could help push along these reforms and highlight the necessity for those reforms, but that is by no means inevitable. The failure of the necessary reforms in those areas could also hamper the effectiveness of the emissions trading system. And so we're looking forward to continuing to support the development of China's emissions trading system and to working here in California to improve the system here. I want to thank our team, Daniel Carpenter Gold, Andrea So, and Kara Horowitz, as well as Dr. Fan Dai and Jem Perrin and Amy Barnes at the California China Climate Institute. And we've also learned quite a lot from working with Dr. Zhang and Qi and their team. They really are all researchers of the highest caliber. I think China is very lucky to have researchers of such high quality and capability, and we look forward to working with you all further in the future. So thank you to all of you, and I look forward to the discussions and questions.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was really wonderful, and really looking forward to hearing from Professors Zhang and Qi. So Professor Zhang, will go to you next. Thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Next, 下一个。Yes, I can see the screen. 就是中国的排放是这个特点和这个加州是不一样的还有一个呢，就是中国的话呢，这个市场化的条件是一个比较大的一个，我觉得对这个建筑态市场是很大的问题。你比如说这个，特别是电力市场它是一个这个由这个政府管制的，也就是说这中国的电价它是由这个政府决定的，这样的话呢，就实际上对我们这个碳市场这个发挥作用这个提出了一个很大的一些挑战这些的话呢，也是我们在中国碳市场所那个设计的时候必须面临的一些考虑。下一个，Next slide please。这里边给出来就是中国这个全国碳市场的一些基本的一些特点首先来讲呢，中国的碳市场呢，它是一个多行业的碳市场，就包括了电力行业，还有一些主要的这种高耗能的工业行业，大概是覆盖了大的8个行业另外的话呢，它这个我们在考虑这个企业的排放里边，除了考虑它的这个直接排放以外还要考虑它的间接排放，这是中国的一个特点。这就刚才那个我已经介绍了，因为中国的这个电力发电行业它这个电力市场是不完全的就是这个比如说我这个在发电行业的它一些这个减排的成本，它的价格信号不能有效的传递到这个工业一些用户，所以说我们在考虑这个节电的责任通过这个市场机制呢非常难的实现，所以说的话呢，我们在考虑这个核算这工业企业这个排放的时候，把这个间接排放和这个电相关的间接排放也考虑了。中国的这个大概的这个全国的碳市场最终的话呢，大概覆盖8500家企业，然后呢排放量的话呢，占到全国这能源相关排放量的70%左右我们在这个配额分配的时候呢，实际上呢考虑了一个是这个是考虑这个是一个间接是一个这个output based free allocation 就是一种基于产出量的一个这个免费发放为主，但未来的话呢也会考虑这拍卖的问题。当然我们这个在这个总量设定的时候，也考虑了一种自上而下和自下而上的一些考虑下一个 PPT 下一张这里边给出来就是大概中国的碳市场的覆盖的行业大概你可以看出，大概它占到这个大概是这个中国排放量的这些大概是72%左右下一个这里边给出来就是就看出来了，就是说刚才王教授也讲了，就是中国碳市场在这个实现这个中国的这个碳减排目标中发挥什么样的作用这也是我们在这个碳市场这个开埠设定所考虑的比如中国的碳市场呢 它是这个中国的那个碳减排的目标啊，是一个强度目标啊。这里边给出来就是说我们如何比较很要考虑让发挥这个碳市场在实现这个强度目标的一些这个作用。这里边有一些这个公式呢，就反映了就是中国的它的开普设定和这个碳强度之间目标之间的一些关系啊。下一个，这就是所谓啊自上而下的啊这个总量设定。下一张 PPT。这个的话呢是一种自下而上的一个 cap setting， 就所谓的啊，因为中国的这个它是一个啊，中国的这个碳市场呢，从本质上来讲，在初始阶段它是一个 multi-sector tradable performance standards 啊，这里边给出从自下而上的啊这种一个啊这个总量设定。实际上从这个里边可以看出来的话呢，就说中国的总量设定它是一个自下而上和自下而上结合的啊这种两种方法相结合的。这么一个总量设定的一个方法啊，实际呢，当然里边的关键啊就是这个基准啊，这个行业的基准是什么样子？因为中国的碳市场的第一阶呢是 tradable performance standards， 这个 standards 是什么样子非常关键啊。下一页啊，这就是啊就是这给出来就是中国啊的这个排放啊怎么样，这个配额是怎么分配的？这里边的话呢，实际上基本上是和这个加州的工业行业的这个配额分配是一样的啊，就包括啊有一个实际的啊这产出量，在一个国家设定的啊一个这 benchmark 啊这个话呢，实际上和加州啊这工业行业这个碳市场分配非常相似啊。下一个。实际上，因为在中国它是一个 tradable performance standards， 实际上这个中国的碳市场呢，它不是一个和这个常规的或者这个典型的cap trade 还是不一样的啊。那我觉得话呢，它实际上中国碳市场来讲，它实际上就引入了3种啊政策工具，这 policy instruments， 一个是就是一个 standards 啊，再一个话呢，对有些企业来讲做的比较好的企业来讲，它是一个 subsidy， 对一些做的差的一些企业来讲呢，它可能就是 tax。啊，实际上它是这样的话呢，是一个 hybrid 啊，就是3种政策工具的啊，这个从本质上是由3种政策工具发挥作用。下一个是啊，就是这个中国的啊一些这个试点碳市场一些发展的情况啊。刚才后边的话呢，这个你看啊几个试点碳市场呢，中国的碳市场呢，实际上先开始在建立全国碳市场之前，先搞了试点。这个建立这个试点碳市场目的有2个啊，一个是的话呢，就帮助地方实现这个二氧化碳的减排和经济能源的转型。但是呢，还有一个更重要的原因啊，就是帮助为这个国家建立国家碳市场这个提供一些经验和教训啊，这是非常重要。所以说从这个图里给出来这几个试点碳市场的话呢，它的这个价格这碳价是非常不一样的啊。最上面的话呢，可能大概是北京的碳价，应该北京试点碳市场碳价呢相对而言高些。后边的话呢，这个齐老师的话呢会可以详细的介绍武汉碳市场的一些情况啊。下一个。这是就是中国这个全国碳市场从去年7月实行这个交易运行以来的一些价格的走势，还有一些还有一些交易量从这边看出来的话呢，从目前来看这个中国的碳市场的碳价大概是60块人民币，60块人民币呢大概是在大概是多少？大概是8美元左右，是吧？8美元，7、8美元左右这么一个情况。从近来看，还是一个上升的。从最近来看，它是一个上升的趋势到这个根据统计的话呢，它是一个电力行业，这样的话大概半数的企业参与了交易的一些活动下边下一张片子。 60块钱人民币的。这里边刚才这个谁呀？刚才那个王教授也谈到了一些，有4个问题这个包括这个有4个问题。第一个问题的话呢，就涉及到是从中国现在是个 rate based， 什么时候向 mass based 的转移这里边大概给出了一个我自己的一个看法。我觉得可能从这个2025年以后开始的话呢，就可能要向这个mass based 的进行这个转移了另外的话呢，可能这个肯定是在这个25年以前，肯定有更多的行业加入到全国碳市场，比如说这个水泥电解铝另外的话呢，也会引入一些这个配额的这个拍卖的一些机制，现在正在积极的，据我了解几个政府部门比如说这个生态环境部，还有这个财政部正在积极的协商，看看在什么时候这个为这个引入这个拍卖来进行协商。还有一个的话呢，就是将来现在这个中国碳市场的交易者呢，它只有这个控牌的企业，未来的话呢，可能第三方的这投资机构也会要进入到交易这个市场另外的话呢，如果我们这个现货交易市场比较成熟比较这个运行比较好的话，这样的话呢，也会考虑引入一些这个期货这样的金融衍生品的发展。这大概是未来的一个展望当然呢，这个在未来的话呢，实际上将来这个怎么样把这个提高这数据质量，因为数据的质量的话呢，是这个交易的一些成功的一个基础，这也非常重要我这个后边的话呢，也会在这个MRV 这方面，特别是在 verification 这方面，会要加强一些工作这样的话呢，实际上我觉得加州这个比如说一些对这个verifier他要这个第三方核查机构他这个核查员他需要有一些 qualification 的要求，还要进行培训，这些的话呢，对中国来讲都是一个非常好的一个借鉴下面我就简单的就介绍这些吧，后边的话有问题的话呢，我也非常愿意和大家进行交流，谢谢大家。因为是在家里，这个信号不好可能非常抱歉
Thank you so much, Professor Zhang, and no need to apologize. It was really wonderful getting to hear your presentation, and I always learn so much from you. And now we will turn to Professor G. Professor Chi, thank you for being with us. We look forward to hearing your remarks.
好的，可以看到我的 PPT 吗？
看到了。
Yes,
声
we
音
can see it.
好 ，OK，大家早上好，晚上好，非常高兴，能够这次这个武汉大学和这个清华大学，美国伯克利加州大学，加州伯克利大学和加州这个 LA UCLA。我们4家大学的共同来对这个中美全国碳市场和区域碳市场呢进行一个比较的这个联合研究这个还是非常有收获。那么湖北试点碳市场作为这个中国最早启动的这个首批2011年底启动碳市场，湖北这个全省呢纳入这个试点碳市场，在中国这个各试点里还是很具有代表性的。因为这个和北京、上海、深圳、广东相比，湖北是一个欠发达的，或者说是一个发展中的地区。它的经济发展的水平、产业结构、能源结构、碳排放的水平，应该说在全国居于中等稍微偏上一点的水平。这个很能够反映全国的这个平均的水平。所以这个湖北试点呢，应该说是中西部地区唯一一个全省域的纳入这个碳交易试点，所以这个它的很多做法和经验呢，对全国碳市场建设还是有一定的这个借鉴性的。第二个，湖北试点碳市场在试点期间还是探索了很多这个一些制度方面的这个探索吧。 为全国碳市场提供了一定的经验和借鉴包括一些教训。那么下面呢，我就简要的对我们的报告里边的这个关于湖北碳市场的发展和这个成效它的制度的特点以及未来面临的挑战，简要的给大家再分享一下。首先呢，这个湖北省试点碳市场，它跟北京和深圳还不大一样，它没有通过地方的立法，而主要通过行政命令的这个形式，行政的手段来这个推动试点碳市场的建设。因此呢，它的行政的和组织的保障、政策的支持是至关重要的。所以呢，湖北省政府就专门成立了协调这个碳市场建设的这个主要问题的一个委员会以及湖北省发改委具体来负责这个碳市场试点的建设。同时呢，湖北省这个在省级层面还专门成立了领导委员会来对这个碳市场建设的重大问题进行协调。同时成立了一个专家委员会，对碳市场建设的这个技术支持进行这个指导同时呢，每一年湖北省拿出了1500万元的人民币来用于整个湖北试点碳市场的建设每一年都要这个资助这么多的这个资金投入，所以湖北省这个高度重视试点碳市场的建设。那么这个试点碳市场呢，它这个涉及的关键的政策要素覆盖范围呢，应该说是这个在7个试点里边门槛是最高的2014年我们启动的时候呢，前3年门槛都在6万吨标煤以上的这个企业，涉及到了10几个这个工业行业，全部无条件强制性纳入试点碳市场。2017年开始呢，跟全国碳市场的这个纳入的门槛我们就保持了一致，降低到1万吨标煤。那么覆盖的这个企业呢，从第一年的138家到2019年也就当前的370多家，涉及到这个行业全部是工业行业，从第一年的12个行业到现在的16个行业。那么总量呢，这个从第一年的3.24亿吨这个随着我们覆盖的企业的数量增加，但是我们总量却在下降从3.24亿吨降到2.8亿，再降到2.53亿吨这个后边呢这个覆盖企业的数量在增加，但是呢总量其实相对而言一直在收紧。这个总量我们在总量的结构上呢也更加的灵活把总量配额的总量分为3部分，大概80%左右的作为初始的这个配额呢，直接免费的分配给了企业，留了一部分作为新增配额，新增企业这个给他预留的配额，和政府为了这个对市场进行这个管控这个调整政府预留配额，分这3部分企业的初始配额、新增预留配额和政府预留配额。那么我们的分配方法呢，2/3的是用的 grandfather也就是历史法在第一年我们12个行业，其实11个行业除了电力，我们都是用的历史法 grandfather。在2015年第2年这个水泥、电力、热力这个我们是转向了标杆法另外的12个行业呢，仍然是用 grandfather这个历史法。到了第3年16年这个把水泥、这个电力热电联产这个全部还是继续坚持用这个标杆法。对于玻璃和陶瓷17年又加了这个玻璃、陶瓷和造纸，用了历史强度法。所以呢，3种免费分配方法里边的 grandfather 的历史法和历史强度法以及标杆法呢，我们都尝试在不同的行业使用了，根据行业数据的可得性目前呢仍然是有2/3的行业9到10个是用的历史法或者 grandfather电力和这个水泥呢用的是benchmark然后玻璃、造纸热电联产用的是这个历史强度法。 那么陶瓷因为它的波动性太大，所以呢，我们就又给它恢复成立式法了啊，试用了2年立式强度法，觉得不合适，它的每年的这个立式强度值波动太大啊，又给它恢复成立式法了。那么这个同时呢，我们为了使得市场每一年的配额呢，供给和需求的关系能够保持大致的平衡稳定，我们还引入了配额分配的这个调整，这个也就是到期这个免费分配的配额，如果没有至少经过1次的市场交易，就年底全部取消。第二个呢，我们实行了双20封顶，也就是在超排20万吨或者初始配额的20%以上那一部分再免费追加，企业在试点期间所承担的这个碳成本限定在20万吨或者20%以内。第三个呢，我们进行事后的市场调整因子引入了，就是说如果上一年市场的配额的供给和需求如果严重失衡我们会引入相关的市场调整因子，在下年度配额分配中呢，使得上一年供过于求那部分或者供不应求那部分的平衡掉这是为了让市场更加的稳定。最后呢，就是企业在这个履约期内，如果发生了这个收购兼并、分拆，或者是关闭，或者是迁出了湖北省，我们也把这些因素呢都考虑进来对它这个配额在下年度分配或者当年度这个进行这个相关的调整。这是几个主要的市场这个制度。那么这个在交易机制方面呢，我们主要交易2种品种，第一个呢就是碳配额，第二个就是 CCER。交易的时间是每天上午的9点半到11点半，下午的1点到3点。那么交易的模式呢，这个有场外交易和场内这个交易2种大宗的这个交易呢是这个场外的协商议价。那么交易的这个单位呢，最小的单位就是这个0.01 MB 每吨。交易者呢，我们是一开始就是完全开放的一个市场，既有覆盖的这个强制纳入的这个控牌企业，也有机构投资者、个人投资者和海外投资者我们这个湖北市场是最开放的一个市场。那么交易这个每年的交易每年的这个年费这个会员费等等呢，全部实行的是免费的这个为了使投资者更多的加入湖北碳市场我们很多举行的这个优惠或者是免费的。这个交易价格这里是比方说这个协商议价的范围是30%交易费是这个卖方的4%。MRV 呢，这个也引入了这个在全国范围内引入了合规的达到一定资质要求的独立第三方的核查机构，而且呢有湖北省政府来出资采购由政府来采购核查服务保证这个核查机构核查的公平性避免和企业的这个共谋。那么这个核查的过程呢，有企业对它核查呢，那么有工作小组进行事前的培训、事中的这个反馈，事后的这个抽查经过这个全过程的这样的一种管理，保证这个数据的质量。而且独立第三方提交的核查报告，有政府在聘请独立第四方随机进行抽查进一步的这个保证这个核查数据的质量。在这个我们这个覆盖这个企业和行业刚才已经说了，不断的增加这个覆盖的范围，从企业的家数也是这个这个参与者、投资者的参与者目前来看呢，有364家企业、273个机构投资者以及近1万的这个个人投资者，这应该在所有试点碳市场里边投资者的这个最多元化。这个特别是个人投资者参与的最多也是最活跃的，那么这个覆盖的这个行业里边呢，钢铁、化工、电力、水泥这4大行业占了最大的比例，其中电力呢占这个27%的这个排放，钢铁和水泥各占21%，化工呢占了12%。 然后覆盖这些这个行业呢，他们这个占全省的总排放达到全省的45%，是全省这些行业覆盖行业占全省经济总产出价值的30%。那么产出的价值呢是在占全省第2产业，就是工业行业的70%。这个是湖北市场碳价格和这个成交量啊。碳价格呢相对比较稳定啊。最近这2年呢又上升到了一个新的平台啊。原先是基本上在20至30元人民币每吨，现在是在30至40元人民币每吨这个价格区间，最高是达到50多块钱。成交量和成交额呢，应该说在全国7个试点，在19年之前一直是占，如果加上我们的现货远期交易，一直占全国7个试点的70%以上啊。目前也是占了一半啊，50%左右。配额供求关系和这个企业这个买卖的情况呢，总体来看，这个还是偏紧啊，配额还是总体来说是短缺的。我们可以看到，出售这个配额总的来看呢，有这个1700多万吨，而购买配额是2500多万吨。这个企业这个获得的这个出售配额获得的收益呢是3.9亿元，而这个购买配额付出的成本是5.8亿元。所以总的来看呢，湖北试点碳场给企业施加的压力还是大于企业从碳场获得的这个收益啊，所以我们的配额总的来说还是偏紧。这是这个我们用的不同的配额分配方法，历史法 grandfather 和这个标杆法相比较，这个我们可以看14年、15年、16年，我们主要是这个历史法和标杆法里边呢，对于这个这种标杆法来说，碳排放下降的比例要远远高于这个用这个历史法的。后来我们同时也纳入了这个历史强度法再加在一块对比呢，仍然是这个标杆法这个对促进企业的这个减排效果要更好这样的比例还是更多一些。从企业这个家属数量来看，这个总的来说呢，湖北的碳市场这个配额总的来看是逐年这个收紧的我们可以看到这个我们虽然有个总量，但是呢，我们实际上每一年发给企业的这个配额都是在这个总量以内都没有超过总量。在这个总量以内呢，我们2/3的行业应该是用的历史法1/3的行业用的是标杆法这个我们可以看到，总的来说呢，这红色的代表这个配额是不够用的，都是短缺的。我们看基本上都是在50%以上的这个企业呢，配额是短缺的。尽管是这样这个我们的配额给企业总的来说偏紧，但是呢，工业增加值我们可以看，因为湖北纳入碳市场的这个工业行业占湖北省第2产业的总产值是70%以上，所以呢，这个用第2产业的这个增加值的这些年来的，从我们启动试点碳市场以来跟全国工业行业第2产业的这个增加值相比，湖北省的一直高于全国平均水平这个尽管我们这个配额总量是在缩紧的，同时呢，我也回应一下王教授 Alex Wang Doctor。他提出的一些这个问题，就是我们也做了一些经济学的这个实证的研究。我们 based on provincial pilot data 我们用省级的面板数据，2008年至2016年用这个双重差分的方法 DID difference in difference 这种计量经济学的方法，剥离了其他的影响因素和其他的政策因素。我们可以发现呢，湖北试点碳上这个对这个总的这个碳排放 和这个碳强度啊，分别下降了19.8和是20这样的百分点。这个我们基于这个中国上市企业的这个企业层面的数据啊，前面是行业层面省级的面板数据，那么这个呢，我们用上市公司的这个企业层面的数据，用03年至16年，就是我们的试点碳厂启动前后这个几年，我们进行 DID 的对比啊，这个双重差分的分析，也发现了湖北试点碳市场呢，导致我们企业的出口的这个绿色这个含量啊，绿色的复杂度，上市企业的啊，在湖北的上市企业增长了8.9%。所以通过我们这两个这个用实际数据的计量经学的实证的分析啊，给出的这个跟我们这个经验的观察数据还是相吻合的啊，还是取得了这个节能减排，同时呢经济增长和这个经济高质量增长这样一种成效。那未来呢，湖北试点碳厂，我认为面临着如下7个方面的这个挑战。第一个呢，就是如何和全国碳市场的发展呢保持协调啊，保持协调。随着我们越来越多的覆盖行业进入到全国碳市场，湖北试点碳厂应该说覆盖的范围在缩小，规模在缩小。那么我们如何来继续发挥试点碳厂的作用并探索新的一些这个经验这是我们面临的新的挑战。第二个呢，我们在考虑对试点碳厂随着更多的行业纳入全国碳市场，那么湖北省内这个试点碳厂，我们准备扩大覆盖的行业，以及降低覆盖行业的这个门槛。我们现在是1万吨，我们考虑比方降低到5000吨标煤，可以纳入更多的行业这个甚至把交通这个建筑，我们也要考虑继续扩大它这个范围。第三呢，我们考虑开发湖北省内的 CER 因为全国碳厂交易的是 CCER 那么我们准备鼓励湖北省内的企业来开发这个 HB CER 湖北 CER， 而且是可交易的，让它在我们试点碳厂继续交易，增加我们的交易的产品，并且用于我们省内的这个抵消。第4个呢，我们如何充分的利用国家给我们双重这个政策优势？这个只有湖北和这个上海具有这种双重的政策优势，就是既是试点碳市场，又是全国碳市场。我们湖北是注册登记结算中心所在地，上海是试点和交易中心所在地，这是一个双重的这个 ETS 的政策优势。我们如何继续发挥并协调好二者的这个发挥协同作用？这是我们需要考虑的。第5个呢，是如何把湖北省会武汉，也就是这个全国注册登记结算中心所在地武汉，打造成全国的碳金融中心，通过碳市场聚集碳金融的优势，促进我们的低碳的产业的发展，并有助于湖北以更高的质量、更低的社会成本实现我们碳中和借助于这个 ETS。最后呢，也是这个因为转力以后，有碳市场从这个发改委转向了生态环境部门，那么他们特别关注的如何使这个减少碳排放和防治大气污染能够产生协同效应就是减碳和这个减污能够双赢，实现协同效应。这是我们想充分利用碳市场来这样做的未来呢，我们重点关注和这个面临的这些挑战。谢谢。谢谢大家。
Thank you so much. And now we will hear from our expert commentary providers on what we've just heard. So I'll start by introducing our first discussant, Dallas Bertraw. Dr. Bertraw is an economist and Darius Gaskin Senior Fellow at Resources for the Future. He has worked to promote efficient control of air pollution and has written extensively on electricity industry regulation and environmental outcomes. Dr. Bertraw has provided technical support in the design of carbon dioxide emissions trading programs in the Northeast states, California, and the European Union. and also serves as the chair of California's Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee. Thank you, Dr. Bertraw, for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And thank you for the opportunity to read these 3 reports. And I really recommend them to our audience. They deserve to be in everyone's library. They're very valuable reference documents, and I learned quite a bit. In the interests of time and so that we can have a discussion, I'm going to focus my remarks on one point, which has to do with the importance to imagine carbon pricing in a flexible way. We heard about the idea of the incremental build out of program design, and that is actually a common feature between Chinese provinces and in California. As I have observed California long enough to see that it has really incrementally built out from a series of early climate policies that look like tradable performance standards to something that we would now describe as a formal emissions carbon market. A key point in that build out in California, and I recommend it as an idea to keep in mind in China, is to recognize the importance of the interaction of pricing with other regulations, and to imagine a portfolio approach, as Alex Wang suggested, a portfolio of climate policies that each help the other to overcome specific obstacles in the decarbonization of our economies. The idea is about evolution and continual reform of these markets. The example from the California side of continuous reform is the transferable lesson of the scoping plan process that integrates technology and science and economics to develop a blueprint for going forward every 5 years, and it revisits that blueprint every 5 years. I think this is a core idea in the Chinese economy also, and so maybe this is something we can learn from each other about. I want to notice that the tradable performance standards, which were emphasized in describing the Chinese system, are really useful for driving innovation. If you imagine the various ways that emissions are squeezed out of an economy, innovation is very important, and the tradable performance standards are very successful in that dimension, but less so in some other dimensions. And I want to also notice the similarity, as our speakers did today, of a tradable performance standard and the output-based allocation in the California Cap and Trade program. Those are very similar elements. And it leads me to suggest that perhaps rather than adopting the vocabulary of moving from a tradable performance standard to pricing, we can think about their coexistence, their overlap. For example, in California today, there continues a tradable performance standard through the renewable portfolio standard for the electricity sector, or the low carbon fuel standards for fuels, or the electric vehicle mandate, which has flexibility in trading. And these coexist with the carbon cap, especially important if there are political or economic constraints that stop the carbon price from going very high. Then we have to imagine the design of these programs to work together. Nonetheless, I want to argue that it is very important to introduce a firm and formal carbon price because it provides a signal, it drives cost effectiveness, it drives energy efficiency where the regulator cannot see it. It is, we would say, leave no low cost emissions reduction behind. If you put a price on emissions to the economy, then all the low hanging fruit will be harvested. And I want to close by just sharing an anecdote, an unreported anecdote from Chancellor Merkel in Germany, who in the fall of 2019 convened a meeting with her economic and environmental advisors. And she was one who was very much in favor of regulatory policies and was not and a strong advocate for markets. But she said at the beginning of this meeting that she had learned there was nothing like a carbon price to drive the expectations of investors so that they would realign their own research portfolios inside their companies. So the pathway in China is promising. The pathway in California is encouraging, and we have very much to learn from each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burtraw. And now we will turn to Dr. Kara Horowitz. Dr. Horowitz is the co-executive director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the UCLA School of Law. She teaches at the law school and directs the work of the Emmett Center to advance innovation research, public policy debate, and legislative reform to address climate change and its effects. Dr. Horowitz's areas of focus include California and federal climate policy and local sustainability. She has testified to the California State Legislature on climate policy and has been quoted in the Washington Post, the Daily Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and more, and serves on the governing boards of local and national environmental organizations, including the Climate Law Institute, Climate Resolve, and the Green LA Coalition. Dr. Horowitz, thank you for being with us. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, Amy. And thank you all for joining us today and for the opportunity to say a few words about this project. Also, in the interest of time, I'll be brief. I know we're running a little bit long and I want to get to questions too. So like Dr. Burtraw, I'll speed through this a bit. I will start by saying this has been a fruitful and productive collaboration, and I'm really grateful for the engagement of experts on both sides in California and in China. I'll focus on three main ideas for my remarks. The first is that just to situate this, the launch of these reports within the broader climate policy context, I'll note that they launch at a time when it is more apparent than ever that we need urgent and ambitious climate action, and we need real reductions in global greenhouse gases. This has never been more clear. We have seen the adoption of ambitious mid and long-term climate goals, but I also think it's fair to say that many jurisdictions don't yet know how to reach those goals cost effectively. There's also uncertainty about how to build the political will that we'll need for the sorts of law and policy changes that will be needed to meet our climate goals. So in other words, we're at a moment where we face significant law and policy implementation questions. The nitty-gritty details of climate policy instrumentation are really at the fore of climate debate. And in this context, it's critical to think strategically and fairly about the role of emissions trading systems. And we have to look hard at the lessons that we've learned from ETS programs in place so far, both about their strengths and about their limits. So that brings us to these reports and to my second point. In this context, there are a few aspects of this project that just strike me as hopefully particularly valuable. One is something that Alex mentioned at the top of the program, which is its contribution to transparency and information sharing. The two reports really contain a wealth of information, some of which was not easily available to the public before now, on the operations, the nitty-gritty details of how these trading systems work, not just in theory, but in practice and in operation. And so I commend the reports to you for that reason alone. A second valuable aspect of the project, I hope, relates to building implementation networks and cross-jurisdictional collaborations. China and California have long, strong history of working together on climate policy. And this project builds on that history and continues it in a very fruitful way. Emission trading systems that are complicated. And through this project, collaborators in China and in California have been able to have frank and open dialogues about some really detailed policy decisions that go into making a robust ETS program on topics such as monitoring, enforcement, reporting details. And so for that reason, I hope, again, it's been valuable. And then third and last, I'll just end by sharing some thoughts about what might come next, some ideas for future work and future collaborations. Of course, this work is far from done. Questions remain about how to structure emissions trading programs in a way that advances equity among and across regions and different populations. Questions remain about how to value and maximize co-benefits. I think Dr. Chi mentioned this in his remarks. The co-benefits of these systems for the reduction of other pollutants besides GHGs is a real potential benefit of the systems. And I think collectively, we are still thinking through the way to value those co-benefits correctly. And as other developing countries begin to consider emissions trading systems, it makes sense to continue thinking through these questions in a way that's sensitive to the national contexts in developing countries in a way that these reports begin to do. With that, I'm happy to close and return it back to you, Amy, again with my thanks.
Thank you, Karen. And we do have a couple of audience questions. So with everybody's permission, we'll just plan to go over a few minutes to get through these questions. If there are other questions from the audience, please do feel free to add those now. Again, if you go down to the bar at the bottom of your screen and click more, you should see a Q&A button. We have a few in there. And so I'm going to start with those, but please do feel free to add others. So I think, Dr. Zhang, you and actually Dr. Chi spoke a little bit about this in your remarks, but there's a question here about third-party auditing of greenhouse gas emissions in the Chinese program. And I was hoping you could answer, just provide a little bit more information about what organizations or who would qualify, and are there any shared mechanisms that you see potentially, or shared organizations that you see potentially between California and China?
好，我觉得我先试图回答一下啊。我觉得是这样啊，现在在这个试点碳市场，实际上每个就是搞这个试点的时候，实际上对这个第三方核查机构每个地方的政府和这个 ETS 主管部门都有它的一些规定有些要求。后边的话呢，也可以让这个齐老师补充。对这个全国碳市场来讲的话呢，就是说现在这个主要是因为这个核查工作主要是有这个监管呀，主要是在这个地方政府这个在地方部门因为他们这个地方政府呢购买是吧？他这个通过政府购买服务的方式来进行这个第三方对这个让第三方核查机构进行核查的这个排放大概是主要是这个地方政府的一些规则据我了解呢，现在这个在这个在中央层面在这个中央政府这层面呢，也在正在制定正在相关的一些规则一些规定或者说一些指南，来这个未来为这个第三方核查机构呢这个提供一些这个eligibility 就是这个 qualification 包括一些 training requirements 这些方面呢，都在正在起草这相关研究和起草相关的一些政策及文件。后边的话呢，我觉得可能会有一个全国性的要求我的预见，这是第一个方面目前的话呢，还是地方政府 local government 这个他这个做的他有一些这个 regulation 是on the third party verification institution， 它是这么个情况。我感觉从我自己的角度来讲，我觉得我非常希望能够出现这种现象，有一个机构，它可以在加州做这个核查服务也可以到中国来做核查服务我是非常支持这种观点的我觉得在中国政府呢，对这方面也是比较 open 的
我简单的补充几点刚才张教授已经说的很清楚了，从全国这个设计。那么我们地方，因为现在张教授也说到了，现在这个对核查机构的筛选使用，主要是由地方政府在完成。那么湖北试点碳场呢，我们在2012年就制定了这个准入我们湖北 进行这个核查的这个第三方机构的一些条件。当时专门组织了一个专家评审委员会，我当时还是任这个评审委员会的主席，来这个对全国有16家全国的这个独立的核查机构申请进入湖北来参与核查。那么第一年呢，我们要求的门槛非常高，就是第一，它具有这个10年的这个核查的这种经历；第二，它必须有至少有6名以上的这个专业的有这个资质证书的这个核查这样的一个资质；第三个，它有1个亿以上的资产的规模有固定的这个办公场所等等，我们有一系列的非常量化的标准。最后在16家这个申请的机构里边，我们只挑选了3家，都是全国前3名的最规模和实力最大的，而且有一定的国际这个经验的这样的这个机构，包括中国质量认证中心，包括传集社这个只选了3家。以后呢，这个我们第二年、第3年，随着这个核查的企业和任务越来越重，时间越来越紧，我们又增加到了6家，但是我们这个要求呢仍然是非常严格，这是第一个啊。第二个呢，就是对独立第三方核查机构提交的核查报告，我们再有这个独立的更加独立的第4方进行抽查。我们这个一般头2年呢，我们是邀请了湖北省外的全国的这个专家组成一个这个专家组，对他们提交的报告进行随机的抽查。另外呢，武汉大学我们这个研究中心也承担这个第4方这个抽查的任务，因为我们在设计每一年的配额的分配和履约，企业要上交多少配额，再新分配多少配额，我们必须要把核查的数据摸得非常清楚，必须要跟企业进行这个进一步的核对，我们才能够摸清企业应该上交多少配额，我们下年应该再给它分配多少配额，我们对整个市场上多余的配额，我们应该怎么处理？所以这个呢，作为这个新一轮周期的配额的分配制定这个研究单位呢，我们也客观上扮演的这样一种抽查的角色和校正的角色所以它经过了几轮的这个校对呢这个数据质量在不断的改进那么我也同意刚才跟张教授一样的观点刚才这个美方的同事这个非常 good idea， 就是如果有这样的更有国际化的这种机构，既能在中国核查，也能在美国核查，这当然是非常好的我们也期待着，谢谢。
Wonderful, thank you. I know we're already a little over time, but I'm just going to take another maybe 3 or 4 minutes and try and wrap up a couple of these questions into one and open them up to any of our panelists or respondents. So there was one question directed to Dr. Cheeve, but I think that may be relevant for everybody, which is, I think, fundamentally about what kinds of policies can exist to reduce the gap between allowances that are available. And I think really the question is about, are there mechanisms to either reduce that gap or maintain by design a tightness of the market that allows us to meet our climate targets? So I think that's one question. And then I think maybe a good question to just sort of conclude on is, what are the cooperation opportunities that all of you see either as authors or reviewers of this paper? And Kara, I think you spoke to this a little bit when you were talking about next steps and opportunities for future work, but what are really the cooperation opportunities between both at the national and subnational level, China's programs and the California program, as well as from the cap and trade auction revenues? I'm going to broaden this question, either cooperation opportunities between the cap and trade programs or looking at the revenue opportunities for investment in the types of technologies and innovation that we need to meet our net zero targets by mid-century. So I'll open that question up for anybody who panelist or respondent who may have a thought on either point, and then we can close the event.
I might just throw out a comment on the second question about co-investment opportunities. I think the politics of, California money going to invest in China or vice versa might be difficult, but it could be interesting. For example, our colleague William Boyd does a lot of work internationally with forests, right? It's sort of investment in forests. It'd be really interesting to think, let's say California and China were to somehow kind of do almost like co-investments in tropical forests in Brazil or Indonesia, and to work out a protocol. The banks do this. China's AIIB is often co-investing with the World Bank for development projects, and they benefit from each other's kind of due diligence and the information sharing and that sort of thing. So that's an area that might be worth exploring.
Any other thoughts from our panelists?
第一个问题我来回应一下，这个关于碳市场配额供给和需求的这个缺口，买卖的缺口有没有政策来进行平衡？我刚才在我的 PPT 里边其实已经介绍了湖北设计的专门为这个问题设计的政策，就是有两个政策。第一个呢，我想这两种政策应该是全球目前运行的碳市场里边只有湖北试点碳场在试行。我们是试点嘛，可以探索。第一个呢，就是我们规定只有至少交易过一次的免费分配的配额，企业才能够 banking。这也是 X 王教授关注的一个问题，我这里也直接回应一下。必须要至少交易一次才能够 banking， 否则到年底直接 cancel， 直接取消掉。这个保证在市场上留下来的配额不会那么多。第二个，我们每一年核发新的配额的时候，我刚才介绍了一个市场调整因子。我们这个市场调整因子就是根据上一年度市场上配额的供给和需求的缺口，把它折算成一个调整的因子。在第二年给企业分配配额的时候，我们按照不同的行业乘上这么一个市场调整因子，使得上一年市场配额的供求或者买卖的缺口基本上给它平衡掉。我们按照新的一年新发放的配额，让它重新寻找供给和需求的这种关系和 match 这个匹配不让上一年多余的或者不够的配额影响到下年度的配额。我们采取的是这两种方法可以供大家分享一下。第三个呢，我觉得在联合投资和联合发表论文，其实我觉得这个是特别好的一个领域。我和张教授以及之前我们联合跟美国的 MIT 的同事，我们已经取得了非常成功的经验。当时是张教授提议，我们联合呢用湖北试点碳场的数据和北京试点碳市场的数据，我们对这个碳市场试点碳场启动前后的数据的质量，随着核查的不断的这个推进，以及碳市场试点碳场不断的建设呢，它的数据的质量是否有所改善？那么核查机构跟企业是否有共谋？政府采购核查服务等等，这些是否有助于数据质量提高？我们这个研究的结果非常有意义这个最后发表在 Nature Climate Change 这样的高水平的期刊上。我想这是个非常成功的合作写论文的这个案例。我们中美的这个碳市场的这个专家完全可以在这里用我们中国全国的和试点碳场的问题数据，以及我们美国加州碳场的这个相关的问题和数据，我们做一些对全球具有这个示范性和这个借鉴意义的一些研究。 完全可以发在高水平的这个期刊上啊。最后一个联合投资的问题，我非常赞成 Alex Wang 教授刚才的这个建议。当然，对于湖北来说，我们湖北省政府和武汉市政府现在是倾尽全力，希望充分发挥全国碳市场注册登记结算中心放在武汉这样的一种政策优势和平台，全力来打造碳金融中心，希望全球碳金融的投资者、碳金融机构能够到武汉来进行这个合作充分利用这个平台。第二个呢，当然我们也非常开放，也希望走出去，在全球，就像我们“一带一路”，我们也是跟很多欧美的发达国家进行这个第三方合作投资。Alex 王教授刚才建议非常好我们也可以在全球寻找这样的清洁的项目进行这个投资是非常好的。谢谢。
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I know we are already well over time, so I think we can close out our conversation this afternoon. I want to thank again all of our panelists and respondents for joining us, and of course to all of the attendees for joining and listening, and especially our organizers and our translators for all of their heroic work translating this difficult and technical conversation. Always really wonderful to be able to learn and hear from each other with very clear translation. So we appreciate your work. Thank you all so much for joining, and please do visit the California China Climate Institute's website for more information on the report and upcoming events. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Amy. Bye.